without further ado, it is my absolute pleasure to be here introducing my friend, my colleague, maybe someday a collaborator, I don't know, Jacob Steere-Williams, who graduated from the University of Minnesota with his PhD in history. He is an associate professor at the College of Charleston in South Carolina. He is the associate editor of the Journal for the History of Medicine and Allied Sciences. He is also the director of medical humanities. He is a father of two, I hear, very energetic children. And he is a very prolific author who's got multiple projects on the go. I hear we're not going to hear too much about typhoid today, but if you're interested, his book, The Filth Disease, Typhoid Fever and the Practices of Epidemiology in Victorian England, is available. It was published by the University of Rochester Press in 2020, and he is now here going to talk to us about being a historian in this pandemic moment and some of the ways that we might learn from infectious disease historians about how to think about this past. Thank you, Jacob.
Thank you. Get the mic smash, start out. Thank you so much, Erica, and thank you all for being here today. It is such a great pleasure to be in Saskatoon for the first time and to be holding space with you all, to see all this amazing student work and this multidisciplinary collaborations happening here in Saskatoon. I want to talk about the history of the present today and to try to do what the skills of historians, the way in which we're trained to try to analyze this moment. And so these are all fledgling ideas. I fully admit to you at the beginning of this talk, but hopefully you'll have some feedback for me. On Sunday, December 5th, 2021, so about a year ago now, I woke up to my normal early morning routine. I usually get up before anybody else in my family does. It's kind of a ritual of mine. I stretched, I brewed some coffee, I did some foam rolling in my back, and I opened my laptop to check the daily news. And that morning, I started with The Guardian, one of my usual news sources. And I read that morning this article, From Pandemic to Endemic, This is How We Might Get Back to Normal, by the well-known science journalist Yasmin Tayeb. The piece was framed in the familiar rhetorical style of, I've got bad news, but I've got some good news, which social psychologist Douglas Maynard argues is a linguistic tool that seeks to ease ruptures in the fabric of everyday life with hopes for the future. It's a kind of well-known style. Tayeb started with the bad news. She said, with unpredictable outbreaks still occurring around the world, and with variants like Omicron raising questions about the virus's contagiousness, we are still very much in a pandemic. So I read that and I'm like, yeah, this is super reasonable. But then Tayeb quickly switched in the rest of the article with the bad news, with the good news, that most scientists agree that the COVID-19 pandemic will end and that the virus will become endemic. Tayeb spent the rest of the Guardian article extolling the virtues of endemic COVID. She said people emerging from despair, diners piling into restaurants, and vaccine cards being checked with decreasing rigor. Endemic, it seems from reading the Guardian article, meant something very simple: the end, a return to normal, a way out of the pandemic. And I distinctly remember reading that Guardian article and being really quite stunned. For an article whose premise was change over time, from pandemic to endemic, it put no timeline on when SARS-CoV-2 would become endemic. And how could anyone make such a prediction in December of 2021? But setting up the story in this rhetorical style of bad news, good news, it at least gave the impression to me that what Tayeb was trying to say is that SARS-CoV-2's endemicity would be soon. And consider the title of the piece, From Pandemic to Endemic, This is How We Might Get Back to Normal. Curiously, outside of a brief mention of vaccination upticks, the article didn't mention any specific prevention or mitigation strategies to lower infection rates, to lower case fatality or mortality rates. It also didn't define endemicity using any measurable scientific threshold. Instead, it opted for what I would call a social one. endemicity meant normalcy, and how, using the premise from this article, will the pandemic become endemic. The implied answer, the more I thought about this, which struck me as almost comical at the time that morning, was COVID-19 becomes endemic when we say that it becomes endemic. It ends when we say that it ends. Tyag's rhetorical flourish reminded me of a quote that morning that many of you in this audience will know by Charles Rosenberg, who argued that in some ways disease does not exist until we have agreed that it does, by perceiving, by naming, and by responding to it. Today in this talk, I want to explore how the inverse of Rosenberg's argument can also be true. How, in my formulation, in some ways disease ceases to exist when we say that it does, by not perceiving, by renaming, and by not responding to it. And this story is a fledgling one. It's incomplete, but it's one of the shifting and nebulous meanings of the history of endemicity. It's a study of historical discontinuities rather than the kind of continuities that historians often study. It's one about the shape of the present of global health, whereby endemic, as I hope to show you today, is a label for diseases that have not been perceived, have not been described, have not been expressed, characterized, or classified. But I'm going to pose a question to you to start. How is endemicity operationalized? Recall that the Guardian article said that most scientists agree that the COVID-19 pandemic will end and that the virus will become endemic. It's a bizarre way, I think, of linking science and society, using tropes of consensus, expertise, and trust in at least three ways. First, the article generalized scientific consensus in December 2021 when it was written, with the phrase most scientists. Second, it implied that experts in virology, epidemiology, have recognizable signposts for endemicity. And third, it tried to build trust in the public by saying that the end will come, but without signifying when that end would come. This was, in other words, an end without an end. Curious readers like me could follow a hyperlink in that December 2021 study, at least in the online version of the Guardian article. And what this did was it sent you to an obscure study published 10 months earlier in Nature in February 2021, which is a poll of 100 immunologists, virologists, and infectious disease experts, in which asked two simple but highly predictive questions. The title of that study, Endemic Future, is where I draw my own title from today, and you can see the two questions that that study asked. The results on the surface seem quite clear. 89% of scientists polled answered that COVID-19 would become an endemic virus, and 34% thought it was likely or very likely that some regions would eliminate SARS-CoV-2. The Nature study didn't say anything about the path to endemicity, but it at least tried to loosely define the term, as you see here, as one that continues to circulate in pockets of the global population. But there was qualitative evidence from the study, too, in Nature that helps, I think, to nuance the percentages from the responses. What Tyag in her article 10 months later, so think about the timeline here, called scientific consensus. Michael Osterholm, who some of you in the audience will know, epidemiologist from the University of Minnesota, responded that eradicating the virus right now from the world is a lot like trying to plan the construction of a stepping stone pathway to the moon. It's unrealistic. Christopher Dye, an epidemiologist from Oxford, was more sanguine, saying that, I guess, super interesting, COVID-19 will be eliminated from some countries. It might be seasonal, with a risk of reintroduction from places where vaccine coverage and public health measures have not been good enough. Examining evolutionary pathways of 4 other coronaviruses, Jenny Levine, infectious disease specialist at Emory, wrote that SARS-CoV-2 will simply become a mild childhood disease, while Jesse Bloom, evolutionary biologist at the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center, provided an altogether different answer, that SARS-CoV-2 will evolve into a seasonal pattern, something like the flu. These were wildly different answers to the question. While the Nature article started with the bang-up conclusion that COVID-19 will become endemic, it ended on a much less certain note, that the path that SARS-CoV-2 might take to become an endemic virus is challenging to predict. And the diversity of opinion from the comments suggests, I think, far less consensus than Taya gleaned in the Guardian article 10 months later. Now, I might add, from the given evidence in either the February 2021 or even when the Guardian wrote their piece in December, that these were all reasonable and I think remain reasonable long-term suggestions for the pathway of COVID-19 in the years and in the decades to come. But let me step back for a moment and contextualize these events that I've explained to you so far, events that we've all lived through. Using a LexisNexis search of global newspapers from January 2020, I found that before the February 2021 Nature study, there was only one significant mention linking COVID-19 and endemicity. On December 28, 2020, Jeremy Farrar, director of the Wellcome and former professor of tropical medicine at Oxford, had an altogether different definition for COVID-19's endemicity. He noted in the Telegraph that we're not going to be free of this pandemic by February. He's talking about 2021. This is now a human endemic infection. But between December 28, 2020, when Farrar said that, and February Nature study of 2021, there were no other mentions in major global newspapers about endemicity for COVID. What's more, the Nature study that I just talked about garnered no significant reporting in global news. And my study reveals that from February 2021 until this concept of COVID's endemicity exploded in December of 2021, endemicity was only used as a metaphor, a social metaphor. Articles talked about endemic vipers in India, endemic dragonflies in New Jersey, endemic corruption in Nigeria, endemic violence in Mexico, an endemic dementia crisis in football. These were the types of ways that endemic was used in that period. So what happened next is, beginning in the first week of December 2021, is something quite remarkable. Endemicity became almost overnight, and I think it still is fundamentally today, the key framing device, the key buzzword for understanding SARS-CoV-2. And my research of global newspapers has found that each week from December 2021, one, if not multiple, global newspapers each week has called COVID-19 an endemic disease. And if you do relational word searches of these trends, what you find is allied words like transition, like end, like soon, like normal. So some further context here, which is fascinating. When the rush towards labeling COVID-19 as endemic began, the WHO reported in the first week of December that despite 4 million confirmed new cases and 52,000 weekly deaths, case incidence of COVID-19 had, when their words, plateaued in this update. The WHO reported on a special focus, however, on what they called at that time, you will remember, a variant of concern, Omicron. This chart helps put this in context too, compiled by the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Resource Center. And it puts this story into a little bit more perspective. The call for endemicity occurred, in other words, at the very moment of the single most significant period of the pandemic. Despite the greatest surge in January and February 2022, almost overnight the media landscape changed, as if a light switch turned on, or turned off, if you will. COVID-19 was no longer a pandemic or an epidemic disease, but it was an endemic one. There was, to be clear, pretty significant pushback against this framing in isolated pockets of the public health community by epidemiologists, evolutionary biologists, and some historians of public health, myself included. And to give you the sense of just how angry I was getting within a few weeks, in January of 2022, I wrote an op-ed about the dangers of calling SARS-CoV-2 endemic, something I was seeing in every major newspaper almost every day. And I sent this op-ed to every major US and British media outlet, and they were the same ones that were calling COVID-19 endemic. And one by one, within 24 hours, The Atlantic, The Guardian, The Washington Post, The LA Times, they all rejected my piece. So I did what any, I think, reasonable academic that was enraged would do, and I went to Twitter. And I basically just tweeted out my op-ed and like the maximum number of tweets that someone can do. And within an hour, that long series of tweets went viral. And within 24 hours, every one of the media outlets that I had written to and who had declined wrote me back and asked if they could publish the piece. And for reasons that I'd be happy to speak with you about afterwards, I declined all of them, mostly just because I was being smug, but no, there's other reasons. And I published it in the British Medical Journal and the Journal of Public Health. A few days after that, I hosted, I'm a guest host in the podcast COVID Calls, one of the longest running public history projects on the pandemic, where I interviewed, among others, the leading American epidemiologist, Eleanor Murray, who's at Boston. And I want to show you a quick clip here, if this works, of my conversation with Ellie, and I'm just going to give you a very brief part of our conversation. Really what... And I'm about to ask Ellie how epidemiologists use endemic. COVID-19. So I want to start our discussion with, my brain only works as a historian, so I'm trying to historicize even the last 6 weeks of how this term has been used. But I want to start with you, Ellie, and with you, Cecilia. And can you start us off with the present? And what I mean by that is, when epidemiologists use the term endemic, what do they mean today? Because so much of our conversation to come today is how much misunderstanding there is around the word endemic and how it's being misused and how it's changed over time. So Ellie, let's start with you. How do epidemiologists use this term?
Yeah, so I think that this is in some ways part of the confusion because there's not necessarily one single definition, even within epidemiology.
And she goes on here to say more about this. And I highly encourage anyone who's interested in public history projects and COVID-19 to check out COVID Calls and the podcast that Scott and I were doing and continue to do. And I don't mean to cut Ellie short here, and she's absolutely brilliant. And what Ellie goes on to say in this episode, after this clip, is that all of the definitions that epidemiologists use today to define epidemiology, endemicity, they roughly coalesce around the idea that endemicity means a disease that regularly occurs in a specific place, in a specific pattern. And she said that, part of something that she was working on even before COVID is trying to determine more measurable way to define endemicity, and it hasn't worked. And as you can see from this clip, basically what she says is there's no consensus on what this term means. It's in other words, a loose definition. So Ellie wasn't alone. A few days after our episode, she really got me thinking about this more. And what I found is that the Columbia School of Public Health, sensing, I think, this historical moment of calling COVID-19 endemic, they put out this article defining the differences between an epidemic, a pandemic, and an endemic. But look closely here. Their definition of an epidemic comes from the CDC. Their definition of a pandemic comes from the WHO. And their definition from an endemic comes from nowhere. It's a loose definition, much in the line of what Ellie had said. So I kept looking, and I went and searched for any definable definition for this concept across a wide range of public health and epidemiology textbooks. And I found answers like the following. This one from the Oxford textbook of Global Public Health. Endemic is defined here as a disease with unique geographical clustering and linked to underlying environmental and ecological causes. Not normal, not celebratory, not low in incidence. In other words, what I'm trying to get at here is the way that endemicity is defined by specialists in epidemiology and public health is, yes, a loose definition, but it's not the definition by which COVID was being called endemic in 2022. By March of 2022, as global rates began to drop from an all-time high of 3 million new cases per day in late January to 1.5, U.S. President Biden, in his first State of the Union address, focused on two items: the Russian invasion of Ukraine and COVID-19. He noted with optimism that we are moving forward safely, back to more normal routines. COVID-19 need no longer control our lives. Now notice that he didn't use the term endemic here, but I think the discourse around endemicity that had been building since December 2021 was clear in Biden's use in associating COVID-19 and normal or normalcy. So let me pose this question to you. Why did we decide to start calling SARS-CoV-2 endemic late in 2021 at the height of the pandemic? And why do we continue to do so now if, according to epidemiologists, endemic as a concept at worst is this ill-defined nebulous term, and at best it's used to define diseases which occur at regular intervals with discernible patterns? The use of endemic in popular discourse seems to defy the contours of this definition today. Even literally today, you can look, there's articles in the news calling it endemic today. The Omicron surge was certainly not a pattern, you can see this today, of a normal distribution of COVID-19 from late 2019. And even when the Omicron surge declined, we witnessed another summer 2022 increase. And the first 3 weeks of October, the month that we're in right now, we've seen rises of both cases and deaths at 7% and 9% respectively. What I want to suggest to you today in trying to work through this history of the present is that employing the term endemic is part of a larger historical pattern. As historian Suman Seth has recently shown, in the 18th century, Western physicians traveling to the tropics frequently employed what I think is a parent term, endemical, to describe diseases unknown to Europe and Europeans, but ones that they might contract in India, in West Africa, or in the Caribbean. Endemical diseases did not move, so to speak, but they were tied to tropical environments. By the mid-19th century, there was a subtle but I think important shift to the use of endemic, derived from the Greek words for in and people. Endemic as a concept was tied to spatial and environmentalist, geographical understanding of disease long in what's called the airs, waters, places tradition in Western medicine. This was a doctrine which, as many of you know, which held that the physical and the mental health of individuals was tied to place, was tied to climate, was tied to weather, food, water, and season. The Epidemiological Society of London, the first organization of its kind, which began in 1850, publicly stated, it's shocking that no one's ever mentioned this. We think of that group as like a group that studied epidemic disease, but they publicly stated their goal in the first issue as the study of both epidemic and endemic diseases and the relationship between the two. So in other words, where I want to start with this historical discussion is endemic has never been an oppositional word to epidemic, but endemic has been a relational word to endemic. Some endemic diseases historically might erupt into epidemic diseases, and some epidemic diseases might resort to endemic diseases, but this was part of an ebb and flow of understanding disease phenomenon. In seeking historical answers to the ambiguity to this term, I think there are four, and there's probably more than four, but that's all my brain can come up with right now, is four overlapping ways that endemic has been used and assembled as a political tool in the past. And I'll spend the second half of my talk today providing some case study for each. So one, I think that endemic has been used as an origin story, as a light switch, as a way for Western doctors to blame the incidence of an epidemic or a pandemic disease that erupts in the global north on the supposedly unhealthy environment or inherently unhygienic nature of people in the global south. And in this model, endemics are the supposed start of all epidemics. In another way, endemic has been used to describe diseases tied intrinsically to the global south that don't erupt into pandemics into the global north, but they might impact Western bodies that travel to those locations. Three, endemic has also been used as a label to diseases that posed obstacles to Western development, either settler colonialism of the 19th century or economic development of the 20th century. And finally, I think endemic has been this other label used by Western officials to refer to nosological obscurities, diseases that just don't fit Western paradigms of biomedicine. And I'll start my discussion today with number one, or act one as I'm calling it, endemic as origin stories. And I'll use the example of the 19th century understanding of cholera. The study of the relationship between endemic and epidemic and the complex reasons why some endemic diseases erupted into epidemics was at the center of the rise of the modern discipline of epidemiology and about the global thinking of disease. As John McPherson, Inspector General of Hospitals in Bengal, noted in 1867, no question in medicine is more interesting than that of an endemic disease taking on the character of an epidemic. So entangled with the rise of modern epidemiology was the global march of Western imperialism and colonialism, which reframed epidemics not just as contagious and non-localized, but foreign and aggressive. So in other words, endemicity was used as a value judgment. By the mid-19th century, Western doctors suggested that cholera was endemic to Southeast Asia, particularly India, and that when it struck Europe, it was, and as Henry Stevens noted in 1849, using a martial metaphor, like an invading army. It was not just pestilential terror that undergird the definition of endemicity here, but moral decay. Framing cholera's origin as endemic to India was part of an imperialist doctrine of blame at the heart of global health. British doctors like Ernest Hart, for example, who was the longtime editor of the British Medical Journal in the 19th century, declared that cholera was a filth disease of India, carried by dirty people to dirty places, and there spread by dirt and the use of dirty water. He really liked this word dirt, I guess. As you will see from the subsequent examples today, and if you look at the WHO category today of neglected tropical diseases, NTDs, they're almost exactly described in the same way. These were not, I would suggest to you, simple rhetorical statements, but they penetrated the heart of global thinking and global acting on public health. The first attempt that I can find to map both global endemicity, so the concept of endemicity, and also the epidemic spread of cholera was by Scottish geographer Alexander Keith Johnson, who in 1856 produced this color-coded map on the origins of endemic diseases and their spread. Johnson situated yellow fever as endemic from Philadelphia to Haiti to Cartagena. He understood leprosy to be endemic in South America, parts of Africa, and India. Y'all up here in Western Canada were struggling with epidemic goiter, apparently. Cholera was endemic to India. And you can see he actually uses the word endemic in all of these examples on this map. And the moral and the racial influence of epidemiological thinking was at the core of Johnson's map. Colonized southern Africa and Australia, for example, were explained as very healthy and flooded with diseases, same as in England, so therefore colonizable, except cholera. Interestingly, Johnson's map also attempted to visualize the geographical pathways, the spread, whereby endemic diseases like cholera, something endemic to Southeast Asia, could erupt. You can see this here by the red lines that he uses and the arrows to show the march of how cholera would reach other areas of the world. There were important policy implications here as well in framing cholera as endemic to Southeast Asia. European delegates of the third meeting of the International Sanitary Conferences in 1866, for example, issued this one report on the origin, endemicity, and transmissibility and propagation of Asiatic cholera. The goal of the 1866 conference was fairly simple: to study the progress of the disease, its march, and its special character, with a view to preventing its introduction into Europe. I mean, this was very clear. Framing cholera as endemic to some parts of the world, in other words, was a direct political strategy of constructing an origin story to Western epidemics. The report ended with an official recommendation to what they called Oriental governments, which were measures by which the disease might be arrested at the very point of its departure on its destructive march, another kind of martial metaphor. In other words, in this example, endemic meant two things: barricading the disease to Southeast Asia, its supposed home, its endemicity, and ending it in Europe. We might hesitate here and consider how this narrative is replaying even today with rises in cholera in Lebanon, in Haiti, in Syria that are labeled as endemic centers of cholera. By the late 19th century, the use of endemicity was tied to the emergent field of tropical medicine. John Sullivan, physician in Havana, Cuba, in the 1870s, published a wide-ranging study of endemic diseases, which he defined in a rather different way diseases not confined to the geographical limits of any particular region, but those that extend to an entire intertropical zone, both in the East and the West Indies. This was an important, I think, definitional shift in the rise of tropical medicine, in identifying the global South as an entire region where some diseases are endemic. While Sullivan spoke of endemicity of yellow fever, of malaria, and cholera, other European specialists in tropical medicine used the label of endemicity to describe diseases that didn't easily map on to Western disease categories, the subject of Act 2 of my talk. And my example here is European research into what at the time was simultaneously called Delhi sore in India, Biskra boils in French-occupied Algeria, Aleppo boutons in the Ottoman Empire, and Oriental sore in parts of China. These were all terms of Western invention. The name Delhi sore, for example, derived from European doctors in Delhi during the 1857 rebellion that saw a skin condition of Indian soldiers, of disfiguring ulcers on the face and the extremities in the Delhi barracks. These British doctors argued that the disease was endemic to Indian soldiers because of unsanitary state of the barracks and the filthy habits of the indigenous troops. These were, of course, common tropes of colonial medicine. 15 years later, in an extensive 4-year study of endemic skin conditions of the tropics commissioned by the British Colonial Office, Doctors Tilbury Fox and Thomas Farquhar in 1876 noted that all of the above conditions that I noted, they argued were one singular disease, that were the same and caused by local environmental origins, endemic, in other words. The English anatomist and surgeon Henry Van Dyke Carter, better known for his collaboration with Henry Gray in the 1850s in producing Gray's Anatomy, where he was the main illustrator, spent most of his career actually in tropical medicine, working in India and Algeria and Crete. And you can see Carter's haunting hand-drawn illustrations of the disease here from the 1870s. But this was more than just professional curiosity in understanding these skin ulcers. Carter was clear of the imperial mission for understanding endemicity. More than 50% of the French soldiers acquired the complaint sometime or another during their stay at Biskra, he argued in the report to the Colonial Office. And as permanent disfiguration results from the scars which are produced, it is desirable that the complaint should be checked. And in sort of Sherlockian 19th century epidemiological fashion, Carter exhausted routes of infection for these boils. He eliminated drinking water, food, heredity, and despite the fact that one of his colleagues, E.A. Parks, claimed that this condition was caused by a living parasite, specialists in tropical medicine like Carter concluded that Delhi boils and Aleppo boils were strictly endemic. The label in this case was a way to distance European bodies from those in the global South. Most of the credit for westernizing the disease goes to Scottish pathologist William Leishman. And despite a slow transformation into what we now call today cutaneous leishmaniasis, the continued use of racially charged endemic terms like Aleppo boils continues today, rearing its ugly head during the current war in Syria, which saw an explosion of cases of cutaneous leishmaniasis, especially after 2013. And notice here the almost inexplicable combination of naming the disease endemic based on place and incidence via race and ethnicity, and the social and political conditions that led to its rise, both in the 19th century and in the 21st. Warfare, forced migration, and the breakdowns of public health infrastructure. Endemic was a way to turn that off. The fluidity between the terms endemic and epidemic began to change in the late 19th century, in part from the rise of Western biomedical and increasingly ecological understandings of disease, and with major shifts in the global distribution of infections. Endemic continued to mean, I think, diseases of specific regions, and to many in the global north, endemicity came to mean remote diseases that were low-level threats to the north and easily contained if they were simply ignored. And today we have a name, as I mentioned, for this, neglected tropical diseases. However, endemicity was not always a way to categorize neglected diseases of the global south. And so in Act 3, I turned to perhaps the most insidious use of endemic for yellow fever. From the 18th century, European doctors had labeled yellow fever as endemic to West Africa and the greater Caribbean basin. And as John McNeil has shown in Mosquito Empires, the disease played a significant role in transforming the Atlantic world from the 17th to the early 20th century. 21st century definitions of endemicity, as I've already discussed, refer to how a disease exists in low incidence and that it's predictable. As perhaps the preeminent disease to be historically labeled as endemic, however, yellow fever hardly fit the pattern. It thrived instead in the ecological restricting of the Caribbean landscape and the plantation economy, helping revolutionaries in North America, Haiti, and Cuba more than Europeans. By the early 20th century, with the rise of a new brand of global health, yellow fever remained one of the quintessentially feared diseases, particularly in West Africa. In the late 1920s, the endemicity of yellow fever reached something of a fever pitch, with both the British colonial government and the Rockefeller Foundation launching extensive field work into the ongoing incidence of the disease. The work of Donald Drysdale Anderson, medical officer of health on the British West African medical staff, provides a useful example. He was ordered by the British Colonial Office in the late 1920s to undertake an extensive study of the conditions that enabled the endemicity of yellow fever in the Oyo and Abeokuta provinces in Nigeria. Anderson's 150-page report provides an alternative to the central mission of the Rockefeller Commission of the late 1920s, which, as Megan Vaughn has shown in an article last year in the Bulletin of the History of Medicine, was geared towards research and not public health intervention. Anderson's directive from the British Colonial Office was simple and actually different. What will it take to eradicate endemic yellow fever? His report reads like a Eurocentric sanitary ethnography of southern Nigeria. He described the geography of each village, the housing, the water supply. He conducted larva studies for the presence of mosquito vectors for malaria and yellow fever, and he took blood samples from children at missionary schools. Anderson also surveyed in ethnographic fashion the religious beliefs of indigenous Nigerians and asserted each village's likelihood to participate in a Western eradication campaign. The people of Ife, he noted, are applicable to those of Elisha, with one remarkable exception. They are, as the Yorubas go, a clean race. He described the people of Oshobo as only recently developing a sanitary conscience. Anderson's solution to endemic yellow fever, a massive 1.2 million pound investment in bush clearing, water supply, conservancy, and hospital provision. But all of these wouldn't work, he argued, with what he called health propaganda, more sanitary instruction in rural villages, health pamphlets in the Yoruba language, and the use of local health promotion films. These were his suggestions. But even with this Eurocentric, Victorian-inspired racial ideology of West Africans' sanitary civilization, Anderson in 1930 was vitally aware that categorizing yellow fever as endemic and solving the problem of endemicity were inexplicably tied to deeper cultural, political, and economic divergences in the global South. Only 2 years after Anderson's report, the Western dream of yellow fever eradication receded after a Brazilian study which showed a more complex ecological picture of endemic yellow fever with multiple potential vectors, human and other mammalian hosts. Eradication wouldn't be predicated on teaching indigenous Africans hygienic modernity, to borrow a phrase from Ruth Rogoski, but from a massive destruction of forest habitats and human and non-human animal hosts. So I'll turn to my final example here, my fourth act of endemicity. At the first World Health Assembly of the WHO in Geneva in 1948, the sole delegate from Iraq, Dr. S. Sahari, professor in pathology and director of the Medical College of Baghdad, requested that the WHO make a special study of Basal, a disease he described as rife in Iraq. The WHO assembled a team, internally labeled WHO VD12, otherwise known as the WHO UNICEF Basal Syphilis Project, led by the London physician George Sconza, who worked for years to unravel the mystery of this disease. Basal was first described as a clinical entity in 1928 by E.H. Huston, who directed a health clinic, part of the American Presbyterian Mission in Deir ez-Zor, Syria, from 1924 to 1936. Hudson described a grossly debilitating infection with the local name Basal. In a series of publications, he argued that the disease was non-venereal form of syphilis, an intermediate between syphilis and yaws, endemic amongst nomadic Bedouins of the Arabian desert. He described the disease as highly infectious, usually contracted and spread through children, but never sexually, but through uncleanliness, with endemic levels in the area reaching in the high 90s. Subsequent European research in the 1930s and the 1940s speculated that basal was nothing more than the local name for syphilis, characterized by unique skin lesions. The task of the WHO committee in 1948 that assembled was to sort out what this disease was and assess its prevalence. The debate hinged on the categorization of the disease. Was it syphilis or was it not? But underlying this study was a moral assessment of the sexual practices of the nomadic Bedouins. The 1948 project began as a 3-year, 3-part study, an epidemiological study in part 1, which you see the map of here, a set of laboratory experiments in year 2 using the Wassermann test, and what the team called in year 3 a mass treatment campaign using penicillin. While laboratory experiments failed to conclusively differentiate syphilis, yaws, and basal, the team concluded that 90% of the adult Bedouins were positive for the Wassermann reaction. The burning question, they said, and no, that's a direct quote, not a pun worthy of Jolie Shackelford. The WHO team reflected this burning question was still in their report, was basal really syphilis? They didn't know. The second advisor for the project, L.G.G. Jones, argued in 1953 that more was at stake, that the consensus in global health at that time was that syphilis was milder in the Middle East and in North Africa than in Europe and North America. By 1953, the WHO team had studied over 3,500 active cases of basal, and they were keen to show the destructiveness of this disease, endemic to the region. Evidenced here by a paper by Jones titled Mutilating Basal, which featured the case study of a severely disfigured patient, 16-year-old Ali, who the team discovered in a rural village in Mosul. The WHO concluded in their 1953 report that the relationship of basal to syphilis is still uncertain, but in practice it responds like all other diseases to penicillin. By 1955, the WHO team had treated over 30,000 people in the region with penicillin, though ultimately the project was strained by logistical problems, principally of transportation in rural areas. What was ultimately needed, they suggested, was to raise the general hygienic standards of nomadic Bedouins, a rather 19th century conclusion, including, curiously enough, they argued at the end of the report, strict regulations of brothels, even though the premise of this study was that this was a non-venereal form of syphilis. The WHO campaign against basal continued into the 1970s when reported rates declined, though today, as you can see here from a recent report on the WHO, global surveillance data is non-existent anymore. So what's striking about this enactment of endemicity is not, I think, the biomedical or ontological relationship between basal or syphilis, not really interested in that, but the way in which endemicity functioned here in global health to both direct an international campaign and then to silence it. And curiously, the science extends to our own histories of global health. You won't find any mention of the WHO basal study, for example, in the otherwise really stellar history of the WHO by Ted Brown, Marcus Cueto, and the late Elizabeth Fee. So let me summarize with some concluding thoughts. In these 4 historical examples, I've tried to demonstrate the complicated and even nebulous ways that endemicity functions as a disease category. There were dozens of other diseases, either neglected or sometimes cessationalized, that have been called endemic in the past 150 years. And the historical patterns map onto the colonial and in some ways the post-colonial politics of global health. By the 1970s, the notion of endemicity was nearly extinct in global epidemiology. Abraham Lilienfeld's 1976 classic, Foundations of Epidemiology, never defined the term and only used it twice in the massive textbook. One to describe Manxi's 1926 study of typhus in Montgomery, Alabama, and in a passing mention of the epidemiology of Kuru in New Guinea, a fascinating case study explored by Warwick Anderson in his book. Before the term exploded in recent months during the COVID-19 pandemic, endemic survived only in discussions of global health. and almost always to describe diseases entrenched in the global south that either disappeared in the west or continue to pose a threat to the global north. And understanding this history, I think, is critical if we're to make sense of SARS-CoV-2, particularly the calls in the last few months of that this disease is now endemic. And we should be asking what motivates this recategorization. Is it simply a product of social function, that simply calling COVID-19 endemic means that we can return to normal, as much of the media suggests? We can move on, that we can put the pandemic behind us? But what political impulses are at stake in relaxing government mitigation strategies, vaccination campaigns, or personal choices like masking? The COVID-19 pandemic has revealed, among many other things, gross structural health inequalities that historians of medicine, many of whom are in this audience, have been working on for decades to try to illuminate. And calls for endemicity might be, I fear, yet another excuse to ignore these entrenched problems in our local communities. But at the global level, something else is at stake. And I fear that the past is more proximate than we think, given the examples that I've outlined for you. That calling COVID-19 endemic is a way for wealthy, resource-rich, heavily vaccinated countries to plunge into a decades-long amnesia of ignoring the disease in the global south, where we still see vaccination rates as very low. The history of endemicity, in other words, is what Foucault famously called the history of the present, a genealogy that is self-admittedly starting with diagnosing the present moment. And my aim today has been to confront some of the ways that power is hidden in our contemporary use of endemic. And this project, I think, is a deeply public one. It's in line with the kind of efforts that you're seeing in the poster presentation today, that y'all are working on with oral history projects, with archiving projects, in public-facing scholarship. And I'm not interested in a past that just reflects, or a past that we learn from, or as a corrective. And I think we've all sort of seen those instrumentalized uses of the history of medicine in the past 3 years. Instead, I think what we've inherited is what Marissa Fuentes calls a mutilated history of global health, down through the very texture of the words that we use, and endemicity is one of them. And I've been researching the history of epidemiology and public health for almost 20 years now, and the one thing that I've learned is that disease events, they don't inherently just exist. Yes, they have a biological reality, but outbreaks are constructed and they're also deconstructed. They're privileged, but they're also ignored. I'll come back to Charles Rosenberg, who famously argued this point in a much more eloquent way than me many years ago. And he said that epidemics have a dramaturgical quality. They're like a play. They're set in time and space. They have actors, they have action, they have declension, they have a beginning, they have an end. But centering global health history on endemic diseases, rather than his formulation of epidemic diseases, shows, I think, that endemics have also always been those disease phenomenon deliberately ignored, not part of the dramaturgy. If communities mobilize around epidemic responses, what they do for endemic ones is demobilize. Endemic is a rhetorical label, then, to turn off epidemic responses or to ignore infectious realities when they're not politically expedient. This shows, I think, that the inverse of the dramaturgy is no less powerful, and it's perhaps even more dramatic. Thank you.
Questions for Jacob? Do you need me to stand here? Jeff. Do you want a microphone?